The ND-80 series of airplanes may be some of the most iconic designs of all time. They even influenced modern jetliners. They were some of the first regional jetliners ever built. Find out why these airplanes remain in widespread service over 60 years since their introduction in this video. Part 1. The DC-9. In the late 1950s, Douglas Aircraft wanted a regional jetliner to compete with the only jetliner they had at the time, the DC-8. This had come up as the Model 2067, a four-engine regional jetliner like the McDonnell 119, but longer. This version was abandoned because there was limited interest shown from airlines. In 1960, Douglas signed a 2-year contract with French company Sud Aviation for technical assistance. Under this contract, Douglas would assist with the caravel and produce a licensed version of the airplane if demand became sufficient. This gave Douglas some knowledge of regional jetliners, and they went back to the drawing board after the contract expired. Shortly after, in 1962, design studies were underway for the Model 2086. This is what would become the DC-9. The first design would seat 63 passengers and weigh 69,000 pounds. This design was modified into the DC-9. Shortly after it was announced that the design would proceed to production, Delta Airlines ordered 15 of the DC-9-10 model. By January 1965, Douglas had 58 orders for the DC-9, with 44 more possible orders. Unlike the main competition, the Boeing 727 Trijet, which used many parts from the earlier 707 as possible, the DC-9 was a brand new design. During the development of the DC-9, Douglas put emphasis on making the DC-9 the most economical jet on the market to facilitate future growth. The DC-9 would end up using Pratt & Whitney JT8D low-bypass turbofan engines, the same engine as the 727. In order for Douglas to reduce some of the financial burden of producing a new airplane, they decided to have de Havilland Canada produce the wings of the airplane, on promises on prospective future production orders. The development of the DC-9 was very fast for a brand new design. The first production model DC-9 flew on February 25, 1965, with the second airplane not far behind, flying just a few weeks later. By July of 1965, Douglas had a fleet of 5 test airplanes. Several refinements were made from these test flights, including replacing the leading edge slats with a more aerodynamic design to reduce drag. The flight test program proceeded rapidly, with the initial model, the DC-9-10, receiving FAA certification on November 23, 1965, with the first of the type entering service with Delta Airlines on December 8, 1965. The DC-9 sold rapidly, becoming the best-selling airliner in the world for a time, beating out Boeing in its 737. By May of 1976, 726 DC-9s had been delivered, but eventually the best-selling airliner had been taken over by the Boeing 737, which has sold 11,965 airplanes as of 2025. While early DC-9s were successful, they had higher production costs than expected, leading the early DC-9s to be sold at a loss. The unfavorable economics of the type negatively impacted Douglas, pushing it into financial hardship. However, the high customer demand for the DC-9 made the company attractive for either acquisition or merge, which would happen in 1967, when Douglas merged with McDonnell Aircraft to make McDonnell Douglas. The DC-9 is one of the longest production aircraft, with the original DC-9 production ending in 1982. But that wasn't the end of the DC-9. But before I get to that, I should go over the variants of the DC-9. DC-9 variants. The DC-9-10. This was the first variant of the DC-9. It was also the smallest, coming in at 104 foot 4 inches and had a maximum takeoff weight of 82,000 pounds. The Series 10, as it was designated, was similar in size to the BAC-111 and Fokker 70. The Series 10 had 2 options for engines. Both are Pratt & Whitney low-bypass turbofan engines. The first was the JT8D-5. This produced 12,500 pound-feet of thrust. The second option was the JT8D-7. This produced 14,000 pound-feet of thrust. This version sold for $5.2 million in 1972, or $39,102,154 in 2025. 135 of this version was built. Delta Airlines was the main operator of the Series 10 with 17 airplanes. The next was the DC-9-20. The Series 20 was unique. It came from a request from Scandinavian Airlines for better short field performance. It used more powerful JT-8D-9 engines. It used the fuselage of the Series 10, but the better and longer wings of the Series 30. Only one DC-9-20 survives in 2025. It is currently used in California and is a skydiver jump airplane. The next was the DC-9-30. The 30 series was produced to counter the Boeing 737. It had a 14-foot fuselage stretch and 3 feet added to the wings, and the leading edge slats that ran the length of the wings. It also utilized JT-8D-11 engines. These produced 15,000 pounds of thrust. The 30 series first entered service with Eastern Airlines in 1967. 662 were built, about 60% of the total number of DC-9s built. Next is the DC-9-40. The Series 40 had a further 6-foot stretch to the fuselage and could accommodate 125 passengers. The first one entered service with Scandinavian Airlines in March 1968. The next is the DC-9-50. The Series 50 was the largest version to enter service. It had a further 8-foot stretch and could seat 139 passengers. It also featured larger engines, the JT-8D-15, producing 16,000 pounds of thrust. The last model was the Douglas C-9 Skytrain II. The Skytrain II is the version of the DC-9-30 that was used as a freight and troop transport for the United States Armed Forces. The name is a throwback to the earlier Douglas DC-3, which is nicknamed the Skytrain. In the late 1970s, as production for the DC-9 started to wrap up, a feasibility study was conducted to see if further development of the line was feasible, and it was. The earliest ideas was to create the Series 55 and the Series 60. Entry to service for the new airplane was targeted for 1980. The new airplane, designated as the Series 80, was the second generation of the line. Swiss Air was the first customer, with an order for 15 of the type being placed, with an additional option for a further 5 airplanes. But all but the last model of the MD-80 series was designated as the DC-9. The first MD-80 was the MD-81. This is introduced with Swiss Air in 1980. The differences between the various long-body Mad Dogs, as they're known, is relatively minor. They only differ in their engines, fuel capacities, and weights. The max takeoff weight for the MD-81 was 140,000 pounds, with an option to expand that to 142,000 pounds. It could carry 155 passengers, a distance of 1,565 nautical miles. The second was the MD-82. The MD-82 was basically just the MD-81, but fitted with JT-8D-217 engines. These produced 20,000 pounds of thrust. It was built for use at airports at high altitudes. American Airlines was the biggest operator of the MD-82, having over 300 in their fleet at one point. The MD-82 had a max takeoff weight of 149,500 pounds. It could carry the same 155 passengers over 2,050 nautical miles. The MD-83 is basically just a longer range version of the MD-82. It featured JT-8D-219 engines that produced 21,000 pounds of thrust. The MD-83 also had 2 more 565-gallon auxiliary fuel tanks, added to expand its range to 2,504 nautical miles. Its max takeoff weight was also increased to 160,000 pounds. Because the MD-83 had a higher operating weight than the previous Mad Dogs, a few changes were made to help the airframe cope with these higher weights. These include a strengthened landing gear, including new tires, wheels, and stronger brakes, and changes to the wing skin. The second to last version is the MD-87. This was a shortened version of the other MD-80s. It would seat between 109 passengers in mixed class and 130 passengers in an all-economy layout. The MD-87 featured the same flight deck and engines, although it did have slight modifications to the tail where it added a small fin above the tailplane. It had a max takeoff weight of 140,000 pounds and a range of 2,370 nautical miles. The MD-88 is a more modernized version of the MD-82. It featured an upgraded flight deck, an updated cabin, and there were no updates to the engines or range. The MD-88F is the freighter conversion of this. The MD-89 was a proposed stretch version of the MD-80 line. It would be able to carry 173 passengers. This is similar to the configuration of the modern Airbus A320, which can seat 140 to 170 passengers, depending on the class configuration. It would have upgraded the standard JT8D-200 low-bypass turbofan engines to IAE V2500 high-bypass turbofan engines, but this concept was passed on, and instead another model, the MD-90, was introduced. The MD-80 Advance. This was an upgrade proposal to make the second generation more up-to-date to the third-gen MD-90s, but this proposal was dropped in 1991. The AEI freighter conversions. In 2010, Aeronautical Engineers Inc. announced a conversion program for the MD-80 series. They submitted proposals to the FAA and got certified to convert the long versions of the MD-80, which is the MD-81, 82, 83, and 88. They added a 85-inch by 135-inch cargo door and modified the main cabin to be a Class E cargo compartment. They also replaced all the windows with lightweight aluminum plugs. The EAT firefighters. In 2013, Ericsson Aerotanker bought 5 MD-87s that were operated by Scandinavian Airlines to possibly replace their aging 1950s Douglas DC-9 propliner firebombers. These MD-87s were the first of the line to be converted to air tankers. The external tank was mounted below the retardant doors. This lowered the release point by 46 inches, mitigating the chance that the retardant could be spread over crucial wing systems or worse, sucked into the engines. In 2019, a global broker of midlife airplanes and other parts signed a contract with Ericsson to build a 6th Mad Dog firebomber. These firebombers are a bit unique in that when making a drop, they have to fly with their gear down and at flaps 40. This reduces the stall risk. This is the only tanker in service to have to do that. The MD-90 is the last of the line officially built by McDonnell Douglas. It was the third generation of the DC-9 line. The MD-90 is a stretched and modernized version of the MD-88. It featured more powerful IAE V2528 engines. Delta Airlines would place an order for 50 MD-90s with an option to purchase a further 110 of the type. The MD-90X. The MD-90X is a further stretched version of the MD-90. It was stretched by 25 feet. It would have been able to carry 180 passengers and would compete with the Boeing 757. It would have been powered by CFM 56-5 or IAE V2500 engines. The MD-94X/P90. The last of the MD-90 series that McDonnell Douglas had thought up was the MD-94X. This would have been a version of the MD-90 that used prop fan engines. Undeducted fan engines or prop fan engines are basically the brainchild of a designer on cocaine who thought, let's make a turboprop, but with the speed of a turbofan. The main downside with these engines was the noise. You may be expecting something like an Allison T56 or a Pratt & Whitney JT8D. No, just no. Prop fan engines are basically the FX-84 Thunder Screech's little brother. They are deafening. And with the problem with these being mounted on the MD-90 is that they were mounted on the back of the airplane, and people sit back there. So they may have received hearing damage on long flights. The MD-90X was launched to compete with the Boeing 7J7, which was another prop fan proposal. This was a prop fan version of the 727-200. The U.S. Navy had shown interest. This would have been the P-9D. It would have replaced the Lockheed P-3 Orion submarine hunters, but they ended up canceling the contract, and the P-3 still remains in service. The MD-95. In 1997, during the MD-90's production run, McDonnell Douglas merged with Boeing, but the MD-95 does not come about just then. It actually traces its roots back to 1983 when Douglas did a study outlined as the DC-9-90. This airplane was proposed with upgrades to JT8D-200 engines. It would have had the standard DC-9 wing, but with 2 foots added to each tip of the wings. It would seat 117 passengers. The DC-990 was originally proposed for the newly deregulated American airline industry, but was postponed because of the 1980s recession. It was again re-announced as the MD-87-105, which means it had 105 seats. McDonnell Douglas, Pratt & Whitney, and the China National Aerotechnology Import-Export Agency agreed that a prototype 105-seat airliner would be shown at the 1991 Paris Air Show. The airplane was designated as the MD-95, which was for the anticipated year that it would begin deliveries. Douglas first offered the airplane for sale in 1994, again with deliveries anticipated for 1995. The MD-95 was envisioned to become a series of aircraft meant to replace the aging DC-9s. In March 1995, longtime customer Scandinavian Airlines chose the Boeing 737-600 over the MD-95. But in October 1995, a customer emerged. The low-cost carrier ValueJet placed an order for 50 of the type, with an option to purchase 50 more airplanes, but none of these would ever be delivered. The MD-95 was going to be powered by the JT-8D-200s, but these were changed to Rolls-Royce 670. When Douglas merged with Boeing, it was expected that the MD-95 program would be canceled, but to everyone's surprise, the project went forward under the name of the Boeing 717. It was originally thought the company had skipped over the designation of 717, but this was the company's internal designation for the KC-135 tanker. The first flight of the 717 took place in September of 1998, with the first operator being the Australian low-cost carrier Impulse, which later merged with Qantas. The capabilities of the 717 soon became clear to Qantas. Being faster than the BAE 146 and having a higher dispatch reliability, the maintenance costs were also lower. Delta marketed the 717 to large airlines that operated the aging DC-9 and early MD-80 models. Boeing had also studied building a stretched variant called the 717-300, but they decided to not go through with building it. The 156th and final 717 rolled off the assembly line in April 2006 for AirTran Airways, which was the 717's launch customer and its last customer. As of 2025, there are 99 717s in service, Delta Airlines operating 80 of them, and Hawaiian Airlines operating 19. While the original DC-9 line is dead, there may be a revival of that type of design. This is the Boeing X-66. This 130 to 210-seat airplane uses a unique design, with 20-degree swept wings and trusses supporting those wings, something not seen on other airliners. The prototype is being built out of an Delta Airlines MD-90. It will remove the original engines and wings and replace them with truss support high wings. There are two types of engines that were proposed for the project: CFM International Rise prop fan engines and the Pratt & Whitney PW102XG. The demonstrator for this airplane is set to fly in 2028. In 2025, this almost 60-year-old design is still in service. What keeps them flying? Well, they're still profitable. There are quite a few operators of this type. The DC-9-10 and DC-9-30 are in service as freighters with Aeronaves TSM of Mexico. The MD-80 line is in service both as freighters and passenger service. Some of the biggest operators of these being Everest Air with 7 of the type, Aeronaves TSM with 15, USA Jet with 8, ATA Airlines with 7, Ericsson Aerotanker with 7 in use as firebombers, Iran Air Tour with 4, Kish Air with 5, and World Atlantic Airlines also with 5. These 3 previous operators all operate passenger service with the MD series. The MD series can also haul quite a bit of cargo compared to the larger 727 and 737. Everest claims that the MD-83 can carry 43,000 pounds of cargo, and USA Jet claims that their MD-88F can haul 45,000 pounds. Compare this to the larger 727, which can haul 50,000 pounds and burns way more fuel. And Aeronaves TSM claims that the 737 can only haul 35,000 pounds. The MD series can haul 10,000 more pounds of cargo for a smaller airframe. The MD and DC-9 are also good for smaller and lesser maintained airports. Since they have high-mounted engines, there is less of a risk of debris getting sucked into the engines. Plus, they have large flaps and can get airborne quickly. Well, that's all I have for you today. This is the longest video I've ever made, and it was a pain in the ass to edit, so if you could, please help me out by giving a like and subscribing. But anyways, I hope to see you in the next one, and bye for now.